2023 is a very different world from just 5 years ago. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one thing has obviously been affected in a major way: European national defense spending. 5 years ago, European governments saw military defense quite differently. In the Western half, with no major wars at home in 70 years, defense spending was placed on the back burner. In the Eastern half, relative peace had begun after the breakup of Yugoslavia, although many countries that shared a border with Russia were still wary after the Russian invasions of Georgia and Crimea. With Trump's criticism of NATO members for not spending enough on defense, many saw the alliance as potentially obsolete. Of course, this has changed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. European defense spending overall went up 14% in 2022, according to research institute SIPRI. Defense contractors began salivating when German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced Germany would reach 2% of GDP spending on defense by 2024, over $2.5 billion USD more than spent in 2022. He would, however, later backtrack this months later, saying Germany would likely not meet his initial target in time. Some of the EU countries with the largest increases in defense spending from 2021 to 2022 were Luxembourg by 40.2%, Lithuania by 32.5%, and Finland by 28.5%. Still, the increase in defense spending did not happen across the board. Out of the 27 members of the EU, 14 countries reduced overall defense spending, the largest being Hungary by 16%, Austria by 14%, and Portugal by 10%. Many would argue that these countries cut defense spending in order to better fund energy price relief efforts. But it still begs the question, is the new narrative that all of Europe is now focused on spending more on home defense really true? In aggregate, European Union states are spending more, 32% more overall than the EU's lowest point in military spending in 2014. But this upward trend on defense spending is not in a vacuum. Global spending on defense has risen 19% since 2015. The world is becoming more unstable, and more countries are realizing that national defense is still required to maintain their sovereignty. When it comes to defense spending as a percent of GDP in the EU, the top 5 nations are Greece, Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, and Latvia, 4 having borders with Russia, and 1 having a large military because of its rivalry with Turkey, that is, Greece. Still, while these nations punch above their weight considerably, they only account for 11% of the EU's national defense spending, with Poland being the largest contributor here. When looking at total numbers, the 5 biggest spenders are Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland, making up almost 70% of the entire EU national defense spending. Now for the lowest spenders, and here we'll again look at military spending as percentage of GDP. The 5 proportionally lowest spenders on their military are Ireland, Malta, Luxembourg, Austria, and Slovenia. Now you can't talk about EU defense without mentioning another multinational organization, NATO. While France's Macron had advocated for an independent European army since at least 2018, even he, this year after lobbying from Central and Eastern EU members, has acquiesced behind NATO. The EU has 27 nations, NATO will have 32 with the addition of Sweden. Still, all 27 EU nations are not in NATO. 4 are still missing from its ranks: Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. NATO members not in the EU include the US, Canada, UK, Iceland, Norway, Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Turkey. The EU has a population of approximately 448 million and a nominal GDP of 15.8 trillion US dollars. NATO has an approximate population of 978 million, almost a billion people, and a nominal GDP of 47.8 trillion US dollars. That means NATO has a population nearly 2.2 times bigger and nominal GDP nearly 3 times bigger than the EU. Something interesting to point out now, when looking back at the list of the EU lowest spenders on military as a percentage of GDP, is that 3 of the 5 lowest are non-NATO members. To repeat, the 4 countries in the EU, but not in NATO, are Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. All 4 had a percentage spend less than 2% of GDP, with Ireland having the lowest at 0.2% in 2022. Malta spends 0.5%, Austria 0.8%, and Cyprus, the odd one out of the bunch, spends 1.7%. Cyprus is likely different here because its exclusion from NATO has much more to do with tensions between Turkish and Greek Cypriots. Ireland and Austria have more ideological reasons for their policy of not joining NATO, principally wanting to keep a smaller military and maintain a policy of neutrality. A big question that is still unanswered is if European Union countries that are in NATO are freeloading off U.S. military support. When looking at raw spending on national defense, the U.S. alone accounts for over 70% of all NATO spending, a major figure, especially after seeing that the U.S. only has 35% of NATO's population and 53% of its nominal GDP. The top 5 overall spenders are the US, UK, Germany, France, and Italy, and account for 87% of all NATO national defense spending. Overall, all EU members in NATO account for only 20% of NATO's overall defense spending, while having 44% of NATO's population and 34% of its GDP. This staggering divide makes it clear, financially at least, the EU's contributions to NATO are dwarfed by the US. So, from this picture, it becomes clearer how much Europe is still divided when it comes to the funding of national defense. Those nations on the easternmost borders, facing dictatorial regimes at their doorsteps, have seen the war as a wake-up to contribute even more to national defense and cooperate with NATO's biggest funder, the US. The larger Western nations, like Germany and France, are much more inclined to gradually increase their military and are much more wary of the US. On the farthest extreme, pacifist neutral nations like Austria and Ireland are much more focused on securing their own security through peace and do not see the Russian invasion as a major reason to change course or to start spending significantly more on their military. With at least 3 main diverging interests when it comes to defense spending in the EU, the question still is unanswered whether the EU as a whole has really changed course on defense strategy since the Russian invasion of Ukraine.